My wife faked a pregnancy so I would pay for an extravagant baby shower. But when I discovered the hoax right in the middle of the celebration, I exposed her and left her without a single guest by her side. There are moments in life that stay with you forever. And for me, one of those moments came with a simple yet earth-shattering phrase, "I'm pregnant." I remember it like it was yesterday. My wife was standing in the kitchen, smiling so wide you'd think she had just won the lottery. And me? I went through the classic stages. Disbelief, excitement, and then sheer, unfiltered terror. Because honestly, who's ever really ready to be a parent? I could barely keep a houseplant alive, and now she was telling me we were about to bring a human being into the world. This is going to be interesting, I thought. First, everything felt amazing. There was this glow in her eyes, this enthusiasm that made me believe this was the start of a new chapter in our lives. She started talking about the baby with a level of detail that left me speechless. Names, colors for the nursery, what kind of diapers we should use. I was still processing the idea of becoming a dad, and she was already debating whether the kid would learn piano or violin. And then came the bombshell. We need to have a baby shower. Not just any baby shower, of course. No, that would be far too simple. It had to be spectacular. Something unique. Her vision included themed decorations, a giant cake, and, if she had the time, she'd probably hire a mariachi band to play while we cut the cake. I tried to be reasonable, suggesting something smaller, more intimate, but her enthusiasm was so contagious, her smile so wide, that I gave in. Because, as she put it, our baby deserves the best. And there I was, diving headfirst into the game. For the first few days, I couldn't help but feel excited. I was already picturing myself holding the baby, teaching them how to ride a bike, explaining why the soccer team I chose was objectively the best in the world. I even started saving more diligently because I knew a big responsibility was coming. I'm ready for this, I told myself. What a fool I was. Soon, though, little things started to catch my attention. Nothing major at first, just details that seemed insignificant. Like how she never showed me any ultrasounds. I'd ask about it, and she always had an answer ready. They're not that exciting yet. I'd rather wait until they look more developed. Or when I said I wanted to go with her to the doctor, and she'd respond with a smile, "Oh, don't worry, love. It's just a quick checkup. Nothing important." At first, I didn't take it seriously. I thought, maybe this is just how women handle these things. But there was something about her behavior that didn't quite add up. There was a slight, over-the-top quality to her gestures, like she was putting on a performance. But who questions the mother of their future child? So I let it go. For now, the straw that broke the camel's back came one day while I was tidying up the house. I came across an empty envelope from a fertility clinic. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then it hit me like a ton of bricks. Why would she have this if she was already pregnant? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it's something she used before getting pregnant, I told myself, but a tiny voice in the back of my head kept whispering that something was off. That voice would only get louder. In that moment, I did what any confused husband would do. I pretended I hadn't seen anything. I tucked the envelope away, smiled when she came back home, and started paying closer attention. I decided that if something was going on, I wasn't going to jump to conclusions. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let myself be taken for a fool. If there was a lie, I was going to find it. And so it began. What had started as the most exciting news of my life was now a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit. And I was determined to solve it, no matter what I uncovered. As the days went by, what started as small doubts began to grow into clear signs that something wasn't right. But of course, I didn't want to seem paranoid. "You're overthinking it," I told myself, though it was getting harder to ignore that little voice in my head. It all started with the doctor's appointments. I was excited to go with her. I wanted to be part of everything. But every time I asked, "When's the next appointment?" "I'd love to go with you," her answer was almost always the same. "Oh, it's nothing important, love. Just a routine checkup, and they don't need both of us there." At first, I believed her. I mean, I'm not a doctor. What do I know about pregnancies? But then I realized this was happening with every single appointment. Then there were the ultrasounds. I kept expecting her to come home one day, thrilled, with that classic black and white image every excited parent shows off. But no, every time I brought it up, there was always an excuse. "They're not clear enough yet. Let's wait until the baby's more developed. It'll look better." Something about it didn't sit right with me. I didn't need a masterpiece. I just wanted to see something that said, "Here's your kid." And as if all that wasn't enough, there was the empty envelope from the fertility clinic. That envelope was like a blaring alarm I couldn't ignore. I found it while cleaning, tucked away among old papers. At first, I didn't think much of it, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. If she was already pregnant, why would she have something from a fertility clinic? I decided to keep the envelope, not because I was afraid, but because I felt like that piece of empty paper was saying more than it should. I told myself that if something was going on, I would need evidence, not just suspicions. Meanwhile, she continued planning the baby shower with overwhelming enthusiasm. Every day there was something new, choosing colors for the decorations, hiring a chef for the menu, and who knows what else. At one point, she even mentioned adding special lights to the garden. To make it magical at night, she said. It all sounded so over the top. I remember one particular moment. We were in a party supply store, and she was choosing between two types of balloons. She showed me a giant bottle-shaped balloon and said with a smile, "Isn't this perfect for our baby?" I looked at her and thought, what if there's no baby? It was like a punch in the gut. But I didn't say anything. I just smiled and said, "Yes, love, it's perfect." Inside, though, my mind was elsewhere. The questions kept piling up, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. Why was there no physical proof of the pregnancy? Why did everything seem to revolve around the event rather than the baby? I tried talking to a close friend about it, but when I explained what was happening, he laughed and said, "You're probably just overthinking. Women like to handle these things their way." His comment didn't help at all, but it made me realize something. If I wanted answers, I had to find them myself. So I started digging. I went through my bank statements to check recent expenses. There were invoices for decorations, catering services, but nothing related to doctor's visits or ultrasounds. I started paying closer attention to her actions, looking for anything that could confirm or disprove my suspicions. And the more I observed, the clearer it became that something didn't add up. One day, while we were at home, she casually said, "You know what would be amazing? Having a violinist at the baby shower. Can you imagine how elegant that would look?" That sentence was the last straw. A violinist. For a baby that, in my mind, was starting to feel more imaginary than real. "Of course, love," I replied, hiding my frustration. But in that moment, I knew I couldn't keep ignoring what was right in front of me. If I wanted the truth, I'd have to wait for the baby shower. That would be the perfect stage. And if I was right, I'd have my chance to expose everything. I convinced myself of one thing. If she wanted a big show, I'd give her one. But this time, I'd be the one closing the curtain. As the day of the baby shower drew closer, things seemed to escalate. My wife was more excited than ever, obsessing over every tiny detail. She spent hours browsing decoration catalogs, meeting with the chef, and making sure everything was perfect. She even asked me to have the lawn mowed because, as she put it, "The garden is the first thing the guests will see." I watched her in silence, nodding along, while the same question kept swirling in my mind. Why all of this if there's no baby? The signs kept piling up. Every time she talked about the baby, she did so with a level of certainty so over the top it felt more like rehearsed theater than a genuine conversation. She even started acting out when no one was around, placing her hand on her belly in a way that was almost comically deliberate. "It's so everyone knows I'm connected to the baby," she said when I asked her why she was doing it even when we were alone. Of course, my role in this play wasn't to confront her just yet. Not yet. My plan was simple. Keep up the act of the supportive, loving husband while waiting for the big day. If I was going to confront her, I wanted to do it with all the evidence and in front of the perfect audience. Her adoring crowd. The week before the baby shower, things reached a whole new level. I was sitting in the living room, checking emails, when she walked in with the biggest grin on her face. "I have the most amazing idea," she said, practically bouncing with excitement. "What idea?" I asked, trying to sound just as enthusiastic. "We're going to have a custom dessert table, macarons, cupcakes, and a giant cake. All baby-themed. Isn't it adorable?" I nodded, barely managing to suppress the bitter laugh rising in my throat. Inside, I was thinking, of course, because nothing screams celebration for a non-existent baby like a dessert table that costs more than my monthly salary. Things kept escalating. One day, she mentioned she'd ordered a special dress for the event, something that would highlight her baby bump. When she said that, I couldn't help but wonder what kind of magic trick she planned to pull off to simulate something that clearly wasn't there. But I kept my thoughts to myself. The final week before the event was crucial, and I wasn't about to sabotage my own plan. The day before the baby shower, the house was absolute chaos. Decorators were coming and going, arranging flowers, hanging lights, and inflating balloons. It was a spectacle that rivaled any wedding, and I stayed in my role as the dedicated husband. I watched silently, mentally noting every detail and preparing for what I knew was about to happen. That night, as we sat down for dinner, she looked happier than ever. "Everything is coming together perfectly, don't you think?" she said as she served the food. "Yes, love, it's looking incredible," I replied with a smile that must have looked genuine. "I can't wait for everyone to see how beautiful everything is. This is going to be an unforgettable day." I couldn't help but think about the irony of her words. Yes, unforgettable, I thought to myself, just not for the reasons you're expecting. That night, I stayed up later than usual, replaying everything in my head. I thought about the exact moment I would step in, how I would do it, and what I would say. I knew that once I did, there would be no turning back. The truth would come out, and I was going to be the one to expose it. Of course, there was always the other side of the coin. What if I was wrong? What if this was all just a big misunderstanding, and somehow she really was pregnant? That doubt crossed my mind for a few seconds, but I quickly dismissed it. There were too many signs, too many clues pointing to the same conclusion. And if I was right, I couldn't let her continue taking me for a fool. Finally, the day of the baby shower arrived. The house had been transformed into a pastel-colored wonderland. Balloons in soft shades decorated every corner. A dessert table worthy of a magazine stood proudly in the center. And there was even a photo booth with a sign that read, "Waiting for our little miracle." The guests began to arrive, and my wife was in her element, greeting everyone with a radiant smile and theatrically cradling her belly. I stayed in the background, quietly observing everything. I knew the moment was drawing closer, and with each passing second, I could feel the tension building inside me. When the room was full, and my wife announced that she was going to give a little speech, I knew the time had come. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was about to happen. If she wanted a show, I thought, I'll give her one. And with that, I stepped forward. The room was packed. Pastel-colored balloons hung from the ceiling. The dessert table was a work of art, and the guests chatted happily while holding glasses of champagne. Everything was perfectly orchestrated, like an event straight out of a magazine. And there was my wife at the center of it all, greeting each guest with a radiant smile and strategically placing her hand on her stomach as if she were posing for a maternity commercial. Meanwhile, I stood in the corner, holding a glass of wine and waiting for my moment. I couldn't help but think about all the money that had gone into this event. The food, the decorations, the violinist now tuning his instrument out in the garden. Every detail seemed more excessive than the last. But what really caught my attention was how comfortable everyone seemed, as if no one else noticed that something wasn't quite right. Maybe I'm the crazy one, I thought for a second. But no, I knew I wasn't. The party carried on. Guests gathered around my wife, congratulating her on the baby, asking her how she was feeling, if she had everything ready for the little one's arrival. She answered each question with an enthusiasm and precision that made me think, if she ever decided to leave it all behind, she'd have a great career as an actress. "Yes, I'm a little tired," she said with an exaggerated sigh, "but it's all worth it for our baby." The laughter and approving nods from the guests only fed my disbelief. Eventually, the moment everyone was waiting for arrived. The speech. My wife stood up, gesturing for silence, and the guests gathered around her. I moved a little closer, still staying in the shadows, as she began to speak. "I just want to thank you all for being here today," she started, with her warm, rehearsed tone. "This is such a special day for us. This baby means so much to me and my husband, and knowing we have your support makes it all the more exciting." People nodded, some clapped softly, and she continued. "Organizing this baby shower has been a dream come true," she said, pausing to gently cradle her belly again. "I'm so grateful to have such a wonderful husband who has been by my side every step of the way." I stared at her, feeling a mix of anger and strange fascination. How could she maintain this lie with so much conviction? Didn't she feel even a little bit guilty? And then I knew, It was my moment. When she finished her speech and the guests started clapping, I stepped forward. Calmly, I grabbed a champagne glass from the nearest table, raised it as if to toast, and said, "Well, I think it's my turn to say a few words." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me, including my wife's, who looked at me with a mix of surprise and slight concern. It wasn't typical for me to step into the spotlight, and she knew it. "I just want to thank everyone for being here today," I began, keeping my tone light and steady. "This is such a special day, isn't it? A celebration of life, family, and, most importantly, the truth." I noticed a slight shift in her expression. For the first time all evening, her smile seemed a bit forced, less natural. The guests were still attentive, some even smiling, unaware of what was coming. "Now, my wife has done an incredible job organizing this baby shower," I continued. "Really, everything is spectacular. But there's something I'd like to clarify. Something I think everyone here deserves to know." I let my words hang in the air for a moment, savoring the tension that was starting to build. My wife stared at me, her eyes slightly wider than usual, as if trying to anticipate what I was about to say. "This baby has something very special," I said, taking a step toward the center of the room. "Something that makes it unique, and that is, it doesn't exist." The reaction was immediate. A ripple of confusion spread through the room, followed by absolute silence. I could see some guests glancing at each other, trying to make sense of what they had just heard. My wife, for her part, stood completely still, her mouth slightly open, as if trying to find the right words. "Yes," I continued, addressing the crowd. "I know it's hard to believe, but after weeks of excuses, non-existent doctor's appointments, and this empty envelope from a fertility clinic that I found at home, I think it's time to face the truth. There is no baby, just a very elaborate lie and a very expensive party." I pulled the envelope out of my jacket pocket and held it up, showing the evidence. A few guests stepped closer to look at it, while others simply stood frozen in place, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. My wife tried to respond. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what you're talking about," but her tone didn't convince anyone. The damage was done, and the tension in the room was palpable. One by one, the guests began gathering their things and heading for the door, murmuring among themselves as they left. Some approached me to say things like, "I'm sorry," or "I had no idea," while others avoided eye contact altogether. When the room was finally empty, my wife and I stood face to face. She was still in the center of the room, surrounded by balloons and decorations, with tears beginning to well up in her eyes. "Why did you do this?" she asked me quietly. "Because someone had to tell the truth," I replied, setting my champagne glass down on the table. "And because I wasn't going to let you keep fooling me." With that, I turned and walked out of the room, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. I knew there was a lot to process, but in that moment, all I felt was relief. The lie was finally over. When I walked out of the room and left the party behind, I felt a momentary sense of relief, as if I had just dropped a heavy weight I'd been carrying for weeks. But as I leaned against the porch railing, the murmur of voices still echoed in my head. I had ended the lie, yes, but now I had to deal with the fallout. I went back inside a few minutes later. The room, which had been filled with laughter and conversation not long ago, now felt like an entirely different place. Most of the balloons still hung from the ceiling, the lights twinkled, and the dessert table remained pristine, as if everything was waiting for guests who would never return. And there was my wife standing in the middle of it all. She no longer looked like the smiling, confident woman who had given a speech earlier. Now, she looked fragile, her hands trembling and her face pale. I stood there for a moment, saying nothing. I wanted her to speak first, to hear what she had to say to justify all of this. But she just stood there, staring at the floor, as if searching for the right words in the cracks of the tiles. Finally, she broke the silence. "Why did you do it like that?" she asked quietly, still not looking me in the eyes. "Why did I do it?" I replied, letting out a bitter laugh. "I think the question should be, why did you do all of this?" She lifted her head, her eyes filled with tears, and then she snapped. "Because I didn't know what else to do," she yelled, her voice breaking with frustration and sobs. "I thought this would bring us closer, that it would make us happy. I didn't think you'd go this far to humiliate me in front of everyone." Her words momentarily left me speechless, but not because I felt pity. It became painfully clear to me this was never about us. It had always been about her. Faking a pregnancy was supposed to make us happy? I asked, trying to keep calm even as my voice hardened with every word. How did you think this would end? Were you planning to fake labor in 6 months? Were we going to buy a doll so people would think we had a baby? This isn't a movie. This is our life. She didn't respond immediately. She covered her face with her hands, as if she wanted to disappear. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I didn't know how to stop. It all got out of control. I thought I could handle it. Her words were honest, but that didn't change anything. She had gone too far and broken something irreparable: trust. We stood in silence for a while, my voice still echoing in the empty room. Finally, I sighed and walked over to the dessert table. I picked up a cupcake, took a bite, and said sarcastically, "Well, at least the food's good. Something had to turn out right." Huh, she stared at me in disbelief, as if she couldn't believe I'd make a comment like that in such a moment. But I didn't say anything else. My patience was gone. I started gathering my things, ready to leave at least for the night. As I pocketed my keys and phone, she took a step toward me. "Does this mean it's over?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I looked her directly in the eyes. There were so many things I wanted to say, but none of them seemed enough to express what I truly felt. Betrayal, disappointment, exhaustion. They were all there, but at the same time, I felt empty. "I don't know," I finally replied, "but I do know one thing. I can't go on like nothing happened. Faking a pregnancy, organizing all of this, it's not just a lie, it's disrespectful. To me, to everyone else, and even to yourself." She tried to speak, but I stopped her with a gesture. I didn't want to hear any more excuses. Not right now. When I left the house, the night was surprisingly quiet. I walked to my car, got in, and sat there for a moment, staring into the void. I wondered how we had ended up here, how something that started as a promise of happiness had turned into a lie so big it couldn't be ignored. I felt a mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for what I thought we had, for what I thought we were building, and relief because finally the truth was out. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but one thing was certain. I couldn't go back to being the same after this. I started the engine and drove away, leaving behind the house, the balloons, and a relationship that would likely never be the same. When I got home, I turned off the car engine but didn't move. I sat there in the darkness, listening to the silence around me, feeling the loneliness creeping into every corner of my mind. Everything that had happened that night was crystal clear, but at the same time, I couldn't help feeling lost. I had ended a monumental lie, yes, but the price was far higher than I'd anticipated. I walked inside, set my keys on the table, and sank onto the couch, staring at the ceiling as if searching for answers in the cracks. My thoughts turned to my wife, the woman who had once been my partner, someone I trusted completely. When had it all gone so wrong? How had we gone from building a life together to becoming strangers trapped in a lie? That night, memories of how it all began flooded my mind. I thought about the moment she told me she was pregnant, the mix of excitement and fear I'd felt, and how I'd chosen to trust her without questioning anything. I remembered how I'd ignored the little signs, convincing myself that everything was fine because I didn't want to face the possibility that it wasn't. I realized that I hadn't just been deceived by her, I'd deceived myself. The idea of having a child, of starting a new chapter in our relationship, had filled me with so much hope. But that hope, that dream, had been built on a lie. As the sunrise began to filter through the windows, so did the decisions I could no longer avoid. I wondered if there was anything left to salvage in our relationship, if we could overcome this. But the truth was, even if I could forgive her one day, the trust was gone. And without trust, no relationship can survive. I decided I needed to talk to her, not to argue, but to close this chapter definitively. The confrontation the night before had been an act of justice, yes, but also of anger. Now, I needed clarity, for her and for myself. I returned to her house around midday. There were no balloons or lights. All that remained was the mess of a party that should never have happened. I knocked on the door, and she opened it after a few seconds. Her face was swollen from crying, and she avoided meeting my eyes. I stepped inside and sat on the couch. She stood there for a moment, as if waiting for me to speak first. Finally, I broke the silence. "I'm not here to fight," I said, my tone much calmer than it had been the night before. "I just want to understand." She sat across from me, her hands folded in her lap. "I don't know what to say," she replied. "This was all a mistake. I never meant to hurt you." I looked at her, searching for something in her words that could ease the pain, but I didn't find it. Her regret was evident, but the damage was done. "Why did you do it?" I asked, this time more firmly. "What did you think was going to happen?" She sighed deeply before finally speaking. "I felt like we were drifting apart," she admitted. "I thought this would bring us closer, that we could be happy if we had something to look forward to together. But then things got out of control, and I didn't know how to stop." Her confession left a bitter taste in my mouth. I could understand her fear, her desire to fix what was broken, but I couldn't accept the path she'd chosen to do it. Faking a pregnancy wasn't just a lie, it was manipulation, a betrayal of everything we had built. "You know the worst part?" I said with a heavy sigh. "It would have been enough for you to just tell me, to say you felt insecure, that something didn't feel right. But this is something I can't ignore." She looked down, saying nothing. At that moment, I knew there was nothing left to add. As I stood to leave, she looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "Is this goodbye?" she asked, her voice trembling. I paused at the door, my back to her for a moment before turning to face her. "I don't know if it's goodbye forever," I admitted, "but I know it's goodbye for now. I need time, and so do you." She nodded, saying nothing more. I walked out of the house and closed the door behind me, knowing that while the chapter was closed, the story wasn't necessarily over. As I walked to my car, I felt a mix of sadness and release. I had lost something important, something I thought would last forever. But I had also regained something priceless, the truth. And even though it hurt, I knew it was the first step toward something better. I drove away, leaving behind the house, the lies, and a relationship that could no longer stand. But deep down, I knew this was also the beginning of a new chapter, one that, now more than ever, I was determined to build on honesty. Because if I learned anything from all of this, it's that the truth, no matter how painful, is always the best path forward. And that's how my story ends. A mix of tough lessons, difficult decisions, and yes, a bit of relief in the end. But now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my place? Do you think I handled it the right way by exposing the truth? Or should I have approached it differently? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to read your perspectives and reflect with you on this situation. Thank you for joining me on this journey. See you in the next story.